Let's talk about Anthony Albanese's leadership woes. Speaking of someone who perhaps if they grew a beard might be able to blend in and not cop so much criticism, the Australian's chief political correspondent Geoff Chambers points out that Anthony Albanese is preparing for one of the toughest weeks of his political career when Parliament returns tomorrow, quote unquote, gasping for clear air to get the government's agenda back on track before Christmas. Now, we've already touched on the government's poor handling of the Israel-Hamas war, but that, of course, follows weeks of failures, including the voice referendum. You've had a 13th interest rate hike. There's been criticism of the government's foreign affairs and immigration policies. Just in the past week, there was that response to the Chinese sonar attack, which none of us were told had happened before the PM jetted off to the US. You had an asylum seeker boat breaching Operation Sovereign Borders. Then there's, of course, the High Court debacle. It all sort of goes on and on. Take a listen to what Michaelia Cash said, unleashing on the government over all this morning.
The High Court bring down its decision and their response is, oh, we're really sorry. We got told we were going to win that case. Not good enough. A federal government prepares for every single contingency, unless, of course, you either don't care or you're incompetent. And I'm giving Labor a tick on both of those things. They don't care and they are incompetent.
Now, Joe, at risk of...
Come on, it was meant to be an either-or.
I'm going to give you the wind-up here, because I know Anthony Albanese is your favourite topic, so... After the voice...
It was 18 months ago, it's not at the moment.
Now Joe's like, don't make
I'm very honest about some trials and tribulations.
After the voice, you know, I didn't think that would hurt the government politically too much, and I don't think it has, to be honest. But since then, you've just had hit after hit after hit after hit. And I don't think it's unfair or outlandish to say that this government could well end up in the same situation as the Rudd-Gillard government, where after one term, you've either got a hung parliament or you're seriously staring down the barrel of losing.
Yeah, well, I don't think there'll be a leadership change because I think Labor has finally learnt that lesson. The question is, how many other lessons has it learnt? Now, the first thing, and I've been saying this for decades about governments, both red and blue, first-term governments, and we always forget this because there's often not that many of them in Australia. It's only relatively recently that every single PM was a first-term Prime Minister. And so we had this never-ending string of stuff-ups. But first-term governments are always really, really wobbly. And we saw that with John Howard. He lost 3 ministers in his first term, including, I think, the Defence Minister. A huge loss. Very, very wobbly. Then he, had the balls to go to an election promising a GST. He just scraped through. More Australians voted against John Howard than for him at that election, but he just held on with a handful of marginals. And now he's regarded as one of the great political statesmen, the greatest political minds, campaigners of a generation, which he is, right? But people forget that, and so this is why I was
seriously comparing Anthony Albanese.
This is why I was. This is why. Well, we'll see. But this is why I was so furious. This is why I was so furious with the decision to roll Rudd, despite his myriad faults, because the minute you do that, you have set a terrible, terrible precedent that means that no first-term government will ever get off the ground. You have to let governments make mistakes and learn from them. And if the government learns from these mistakes, and there are a couple of lessons here. One is anything that has even the whiff of wokeness about it will go down like a lead balloon, and The Voice was able to be cast as that, even though personally I did not think it was, and very much campaigned the other direction. And that horrible lefty mindset of just abusing everyone who didn't disagree with you for not being progressive enough or being on the wrong side of the history. So the minute you start doing that, and again, as I've been saying for years, you have lost, and you have lost Middle Australia, and you've lost migrant Australia too. And we saw all that reflected in the Voice referendum. Then you've got the fact that about 90% of being a Prime Minister is crisis management. And so it's about how you respond to crises. You don't get to set the agenda, the world around you, and Albo's been used to doing that as a power broker with ALP, controlling the environment around him, so he's got to learn he can't do that. He's got to sometimes react. And then, of course, the cost of living stuff. There's got to be action on cost of living, and there's got to seem to be action on cost of living. And even if they can't actually do anything, they need to show that they are doing something, and I think Paul's right, and that maybe it's time for some movement on the petrol tax.
Well, I was going to say, that's the one thing, and you bang on about it. I wrote about it last week. Gina Rinehart's jumped on board as well. It is the number one thing. It's the number one thing that could
Twitter's
be done
favourites.
to just
if
the
nothing
government
else,
takes 49 cents in every litre.
it's the acknowledgement of the problem, right? Because often again, Australia will generally speaking give a first-term government benefit of the doubt when they go back to re-elect them, right? The difference, however, between this government and Abbott, Rudd or Howard is there is no backbench to burn. All right. So Abbott and Rudd both had 90 seats in the parliament. Howard, I think, 96 almost. So you could afford to have an unpopular idea or the sands shift on you, and there was still enough left over for you to hold on. These people are only in power just 33% primary vote. Yeah. Just, right? So the likelihood of some seats in Western Australia going back to the Libs because they hit a high watermark last time, the likelihood of the Greens being able to increase their primary vote by targeting renters. They got 13% of the national vote now, 30% of people rent. If they shift 5% of those people, then guess what? Greens don't finish second, they finish first. Labor preferences change the nature of the parliament. What is really going to be interesting this week? Two big things. One, more inflation numbers are going to come out, the monthly by monthly numbers we get. The expectation is that it could well be 5.6%, which would mean no great change. In fact, everything stays bad. The petrol thing is about acknowledging that there's a problem, but equally so. What will determine whether this is just a lull or a big turn is in part the performance of the opposition. The opposition needs to be able to stand up and not just say, Mr Prime Minister, about cost of living, because then they'll pivot that off to, we've spent $26 billion on this, that and the other. Prime Minister, petrol is up 19%, this is up 19%, this is up 8%. List the actual items because that's what they'll run on the 6 p.m.
And they could just get them from your show every night, Paul.
You mentioned the
I'm nothing if not a messaging machine.